word, the component of the word anarcho-syndicalism, which is the anarcho part, might be seen to be problematic. But in fact, post-Occupy, there has been a real growth in interest in these anarchist traditions. And the event that I spoke at this last weekend, which was called the Toronto Anarchist Fair, was hugely popular. It was like hundreds, and what is even more interesting is that the demographic of the people who were there were almost entirely 20-year-olds. Like, they were a generation that did not grow up with these kinds of traditions. So the anarcho part of anarcho-syndicalism seems to be back with a certain portion of the youth.
Yes.
And I wonder if you could say a little bit about that part of the word anarcho-syndicalism, and maybe its history and its geographical attachments.
Well, sure. I mean, look, every term has its pluses and its minuses. It alienates some and it attracts others. So, you know, to some extent, it's a tactical decision what name you're going to emphasize. Of course, the anarcho part of anarcho-syndicalism is very useful in that it illustrates the stream from which, or part of the stream from which the movement came, and points radical syndicalism right back to, you know, arguably who's its founder, Michael Bakunin, the Russian radical and aristocrat who basically laid it all out before the term anarcho-syndicalism became common. Sure, it traces the movement back to that element of European socialism, which, against Karl Marx, argued for a collectivized but decentralized, directly worker-run society and economy that objected to a political strategy of relying on socialist parliamentarians and the liberation of the working class through a centralized state that would own everything. That's the anarcho word is very useful. We might add, you know, we might say that Bakunin himself, although he used the word occasionally just like Proudhon had before him, preferred words like collectivism and socialism, but, you know, that's as it is. Still, that anarcho word, of course, it traces the history, it indicates the path of the movement, and you're quite right. I don't doubt it that hundreds of young men and women are attracted to the term and came out to an anarchist event. The question is the movement not also interested in attracting working men and women who don't have, you know, an affection for 19th century socialist theories and might be put off by terms that they associate with Molotov cocktails and bad behavior? You know,
I wonder, and yeah, I mean, could it be that there are people who are not interested in 19th century socialists? Probably, but I'm wondering if clearly the word or the component of the etymological element, anarcho, has some kind of cool factors
no doubt
associated with it. But I'm wondering if, let's say, and this is a rhetorical question clearly, whether the kids, let's say, who turned out for Occupy,
yes,
whether it's in New York or in Toronto or the other cities where there was an Occupy eruption, were in fact doing anarchism, but without having read Bakunin or even knowing who Bakunin was. So could it be then the anarcho element is a kind of a natural desire to work collectively, which exists outside of any ideological construct?
Oh, I think absolutely. I think what humans yearn for is to be both free as individuals and to engage with others in voluntary social processes. And so when you act like that, you're being an anarchist, and it doesn't matter if you haven't read a book or not. I mean, I think all the genuine theorists have been aware of that they're just They're just sort of sorting out what already is possible and or in place, and you know, is an expression of the, I don't want to say the natural impetus, but almost the sort of social impetus that people have as they try to make the world better. And I think the words are perfectly honorable, and I'm not in favor of ditching the prefix anarcho, but there may be contexts where you don't play it up. That's all.
So that seems to nail both the relevance and the historical location of the word, of the anarcho component of anarcho-syndicalism, and clearly there is a resonance with a significant portion of youth in 2013. What about the syndicalist part? Because that is certainly less used and less commonly available to people. Could you say a bit about syndicalism and what that means? Because I think the trade union movement, the mainstream trade union movement, which people think of as the trade union movement, rarely, if ever, refers to syndicalism. So could you say a bit?
No, I guess in that sense, it's that part of the term. Syndicalism has no resonance at all. I mean, anarcho has much more. But I mean, let's think about what it actually means. It's just the French word syndicat for union. It just comes from that, or sindicato in Spanish. So it's not, all it means is union. So it probably doesn't matter that it doesn't have a lot of resonance. What's its importance? Well, it stresses the extent to which this anarcho-syndicalism was a fusion of a certain social movement against the centralized state with the organizations of the workers, otherwise known as unions. And so insofar as the beginning of the 20th century, the French CGT was instrumental in how should we say it, sort of incarnating this movement in their organization, and you know, one of the main theoretical documents comes out of the Congress of Amiens in 1906. The French word was going to be used, so it's a kind of compromise document between different types of anarchists and union activists. So they fuse the word, and you get anarcho-syndicalist. Though I'm not sure that the word was even used at that time that much. It may become more popular a couple of decades later. In any case, that's what what does syndicalist mean? It means the pursuit of libertarian politics through, not exclusively, but mainly the organizations of the workers. What do we call the organizations of the workers? Unions. What are they called in French? Syndicats. It's as simple as that.
And the CGT is a Confédération
Générale du Travail. It became communist later on. The French CGT today is not syndicalist. The Spanish CGT is. I mean, this is the story of the way history twists and turns in different del trabajo, and it grew out. We may want to get into this at some. It grew out of the Spanish CNT, which was the huge anarcho-syndicalist organization before and during the Spanish Civil War, and indeed after. But that's another. You know, so I think it's not that the word syndicalism has cachet. It has none. It's just a word that means union, and I guess it's come to mean, if you say you're a syndicalist, I suppose now in contemporary English, that means not that you're a trade, it means more than that you're a trade unionist. It means you believe in unions with an anarchist orientation, but still that's where the word comes from. It just means union.
So we've tracked the word itself and to some extent its origins. If I asked you to say what an anarcho-syndicalist organization or union might look like or be in multisyllabic words, how would you describe the anarcho-syndicalist spirit, so to speak?
Well, again, I think the main idea can really be drawn from its founding document way back there in 1906. The idea is an organization that essentially does two things. Like all unions purport to do, it seeks to defend defend workers or with work, because really the organization is nothing more than the workers themselves, but the organization through which workers defend themselves in their day-to-day struggles with the employer and sometimes the state and sometimes landlords. And at the same time, it's an organization that sort of, without getting into too much detail, perhaps plots are the wrong word, plans a future that's different, a future in which the workers move from reacting to the assaults of capital in the state to a society in which the workers, through a decentralized system, plan and regulate the economy for the good of humanity in general. I mean, I think that's it in a nutshell. Defensive, deal with issues today, and plan for a new world, and behave today in a way, organize today in a way that prepares the ground and indeed imitates the society that's to come.
Let me pose, because these are both honorable and inspiring ideas, let us say. Let me pose a challenge that was posed to me and my colleague Ajamu last week at the Toronto Anarchist Fair, after we had praised and advocated self-management by workers of their workplaces, and had received, I may say, a very warm reception by the audience. Nonetheless, in the conversations that occurred after the presentation that we gave, clearly there was skepticism, and among a group which I assume in principle was fairly supportive of the notion. And essentially what they were saying, I think, was that it sounds good in principle, and even if they accept what I told them, which is that this is not just pie in the sky, there are areas of the world where anarcho-syndicalism and the unions that support it are alive and well, if not dominant, as a part of the working class, as a part of working class organizations. Yet it is somewhat localized. You know, even if there are expressions, and we will talk about this later, even if there are incarnations of the anarcho-syndicalist tradition in North America and increasingly around the world, nonetheless, the centers of strength of anarcho-syndicalist unionism are relatively limited.
Yeah.
And could one argue, to cut a long story short, could one argue that the syndicalist, anarcho-syndicalist tradition in the West, in the Anglo-American world, which was relatively strong in the beginning of the 20th century, has in fact lost its battle with mainstream unionism?
Well, there are a few questions there. I think at first, I thought where you were going was, is worker self-management feasible? That itself is reasonable grounds for skepticism. I mean, but I think it's not hard to make a case to simply show examples of worker-run enterprises that flourish.
Yeah, I should apologize for that kind of digression. What I was trying to get at was that the same skepticism that I heard around worker self-management might well apply to
the union itself, to the organization,
to a libertarian philosophy of trade unionism.
Yes, sure.
Whereby you basically let the workers control the union.
I get, yes,
right?
Sure.
Yeah. So, could you address?
No, of course. That's a. I mean, it's indisputable that your point, or the point of the skeptics, that unions of this type tend to be geographically limited. They're in certain places, and they're of very little importance in others. There's no what point would there be in denying the truth? I mean, I guess the concept. However, it's interesting to note that where they're strong varies to the point that I would argue that it isn't that given their strength in countries with quite different political traditions, that reality would militate against the idea that they only have a place in certain pockets. This is what I mean. It's true that the greatest concentration of sort of official anarcho-syndicalism today remains in Spain, where though the General Confederation of Labor is smaller than the pro-communist and pro-socialist unions by quite a bit, it's still very big. I think it's come close to cracking 1 million votes in union elections in Spain, and it has tens of thousands of members. I think it's in the sort of 50 to 60,000 range in terms of members, but gets a lot of votes in workplace elections. So it's very big. But and some will say, you know, that's a feature. The continuing survival of anarcho-syndicalism in Spain, to the extent it goes on, and it's primarily but not exclusively, by no means exclusively in Catalonia, is an expression of kind of regional traditions and regional moods. But if we also can, you know, the SAC in Sweden is remarkably strong, and its membership as a proportion of the population in Sweden is pretty significant, or more significant proportionally speaking than in most of Spain. Why do we rate that? Well, Sweden is a whole different kettle of fish than Spain. It's a state with a long tradition of social democracy and an interventionist, fairly egalitarian public sector. They're quite different, Sweden and Spain, yet they both have flourishing anarcho-syndicalist unions. So it's not. It seems to live in different kind of places. It's also the CNT in France is small, but grew like a weed in the 90s and early 2000s. So you know, it's here and it's there and it's elsewhere, and so it shows the potential to flourish in kind of different gardens. Now the question, historically speaking, has it been defeated by mainstream social democratic Marxist-inspired trade unionism? I don't think defeated. I think recent years suggest its regrowth in various countries. Certainly it was all but vanquished in most of the industrialized world. Does this mean, what does this mean? Does it mean a permanent decision by history? I doubt it. Things go up and down in history, and you shouldn't decide that because a movement loses influence over the course of several decades, it was therefore wrong and the ascendant movement was right. I don't think history works that way. I think you always have to evaluate movements and ideas on their merits, and if you see that they haven't quite been stamped out and in fact are showing a resurgence, then they deserve a second and a third look, I think. Also I think to talk about the victory of mainstream labor unionism is to kid yourself. The membership of pro-social democratic labor unions as a proportion of the populations has been plummeting in much of the Western world. They don't, unlike your fare that draw in all kinds of anarchist youth, excite any enthusiasm. I'm not exaggerating, any enthusiasm among young people in say Canada, for example. They're moribund, though they're you know, the reality hasn't completely that isn't entirely apparent when you see how many members they have. But if you look at it in a social context, I think it's reasonable to conclude the mainstream trade unionism is in crisis. Mainstream unions get excited about themselves, and they can certainly throw a party. Yeah. I'm not, and this isn't an absolute kind of statement. And you know, we should get to a question. This isn't about, you know, our line here isn't about mocking or demonizing or saying that mainstream unions are useless. In fact, what would help them a lot, I think, is an infusion of certain syndicalist principles that are compatible with some of the things they do, not incompatible with some of the others. But you know, so I don't exactly. I mentioned the Spanish context because we did. There is a pluralism in trade unionism in parts of Europe, Spain for example, that doesn't exist in Canada. Look, here imagine I work in a hotel in Toronto, or I work in a supermarket, and the UFCW, United Food and Commercial Workers Union, comes to organize that workplace. Well, you know the Ontario Labour Relations Board process. Cards are distributed and the workers vote for the UFCW or nothing. Or they don't even. They vote for the opportunity to have a union election or not. But there's no notion that perhaps workers should have their choice between different unions when they vote. It's the UFCW or nothing. In my case, that would lead to no, I don't want to see neither hide nor tail of them, so I would vote no. But in a Spanish enterprise, workers can call a workplace election to the Comité de Empresa, the company enterprise, and all the unions will put forward candidates, and you'll end up with a workplace committee that might have, for example, say it has 12 delegates. 7 of them will be from the pro-communist workers' commissions, 2 of them will be from the socialist one, and 3 of them will be from the Anarcho-Syndicalist CGT. What you get is a genuine reflection of the political or union sympathies of the workforce. There's no be in a union or not. There's a recognition, because I guess the rich tradition of the left in Southern Europe, that everybody knows that there is such a thing as different opinions. It's not just I'm for the union or not, because the union might be a piece of shit. The union might be worthwhile. That kind of thing would be really useful, I think, in labor relations in North America, for example, or in the Anglo-Saxon world, an awareness that maybe into the labor movement itself the notion of pluralism might fit. That's a hard one, I know, for some in the CLC, but it would be an idea.
Let me ask you this, in that you have made the point that certainly within the union movement, let's say, the union structure, syndicalist elements, anarcho-syndicalist elements might have something to offer at a time when, as you put it, mainstream unionism, business unionism, and or social democratic unionism seems to be experiencing some significant loss of credibility. So from a union movement itself, there might be perceived to be an interest in new ways of operating, of which syndicalism might be a component.
Right.
What I would like us to focus on now is this. We have in many countries in the world, I'm not sure what the level is in Canada, 20 or 30% unemployment among young people, let us say under 30-year-old, and kids coming out of training, which is promoted heavily by various kinds of state apparati, is often a prelude to extended periods of unemployment. What would anarcho-syndicalist union traditions give to, let's say, younger workers, obviously not those unemployed, although it could be, now that mainstream unionism would not offer or cannot offer?
Well, I'm not sure that it's wise to promise the moon. I mean, in the sense that high levels of structural unemployment, my reaction isn't that this can be corrected by a labor movement with the right attitude, except to say that I think for reasons that are understandable, the mainstream labor movement is reluctant to tackle such issues as job sharing, the distribution of available work among all those who need it, for reasons that fairly clear. Their memberships themselves would be uncomfortable with those ideas. But I'm not going I mean, I'm not going to I wouldn't suggest that anarcho-syndicalism has a model for the short term, for tomorrow, that could generate work for young people who are out of work today. Although I do think it's a vision of an economy in which anyone who's left out, let me rephrase that, an economy that leaves large sections of the population out is not an economy worth having, and so would have to be restructured around the principle that work must be distributed in a way that everyone is able to well, have a turn at it, as it were. I mean, I think syndicalism's or anarcho-syndicalism's lessons for the mainstream labor movement would be other than sort of magic pills to economic problems. I think they would be suggestions about how unions might best run and how unions might become more dynamic, which is not especially complicated. It's that they have to become organizations that are run by and driven by their base, their membership, more than top-heavy organizations whose raison d'etre unfortunately often becomes the furnishing of a six-figure salary and many large five-figure salaries to people through the bureaucracy and in the political leadership. And I think the model is of a worker-run organization. You know, the old anarchist slogan, "The workers won't be free unless they free themselves," applies to unions today. What is a union? What is a real union? It's an organization by the workers for the workers, where they stick up for each other. This happens, of course, in the so-called the organizations we're calling the mainstream unions, but not that much and not enough. So that democratization of the structure, turning them more into organizations that are run by the people that belong to them rather than the people who are paid to run them. These are the things these are the medicines that I think the contemporary labor movement needs. And where do they come from? They come from the pharmacy called anarcho-syndicalism, which has been around for a long time.
Let me pose two possible, to some extent answering my own question, but let me pose two possible roles that this anarcho-syndicalist stream could address better than others, perhaps, that are currently relatively unexplored. One is the significant proportion of young people who are finding it hard to find work. Could we argue that the anarcho-syndicalist tradition is better suited to channel the anger and frustration that inevitably arises, and I would argue fueled the Occupy movement? Could we argue that anarcho-syndicalism is better suited to channeling and engaging with that anger than the other forms?
Yeah, I do think so, and I think in a very constructive way, because I think what anarcho-syndicalism is very compatible with, and indeed historically has been accompanied by, is a sort of socialist do-it-yourselfism, which instead of finding no outlet at all in despair and complaint, and there's nothing wrong with protest is good, so I'm not putting down protest, but instead of finding an outlet in despair and complaint is, for example, the creation of networks of alternative enterprises, not-for-profit enterprises, cooperatives, worker initiatives that provide employment to and this has been done many times historically. There were in the 1920s, when the Spanish CNT was very revolutionary, its rhetoric was very revolutionary. It also had a network of cooperative enterprises where workers were employed. In the 1920s, the general secretary of the CNT, while he headed up the union, as it were, and heading up in that context meant coordinating, because it's a very democratic organization. While while he led the organization and edited its publication, he also worked, as he had for his entire working life, in a cooperatively owned glass factory. And that's I think in that sense, the movement has ideas that young people out of work could benefit from greatly. But I do think there has to be a real cultural shift. I think we have created a culture of a culture in which protest takes the form of telling the state to solve our problems. It's not going well, Prime Minister Harper, so create jobs. Or if Prime Minister Harper can't be trusted to create jobs, we'll elect the latest NDP leader to create jobs. And I think that's not always been the perspective on the radical left. The radical left at one time in Europe created entire networks of educational institutions, of daycare centers, of enterprises, because they knew the state wasn't to be trusted. The state wasn't in that business at that time, but the state was also not to be trusted. You want to educate your children? Don't send them to number 42 Orchard Park Public School. Set up our own institution where workers' children will learn what workers and teachers and university students think they ought to learn. Now, can we go back to that? Can we recreate models? Maybe not, but we can take what was good from that and maybe recreate a culture of self-reliance. By self-reliance, I don't mean a kind of right-wing go it alone sort of self-reliance. I'm talking about communities and working people taking control of their own lives and not thinking that an essentially inefficient and corrupt organization known as the centralized state will do it for them. So in that sense, I think the culture is completely compatible with an answer, or part of an answer, because we always have to remember that this tradition doesn't say to out-of-work young people, we have an answer for you. It says we have a framework in which you, with everyone else, can work out answers for your own lives. But that framework is an attractive one, and it isn't coming from any other quarter in society.
Anarcho-syndicalist tradition should and could well address is the matter, given the continuing growth in the proportion of Western populations that are filled with immigrant workers who are filling jobs in the economy that are relatively poor paid, relatively unprotected. The traditional phrase for talking about these kinds of workers in the union movement has been organizing the unorganized. For one reason or another, and I won't go into it, this is less of a priority for mainstream unions currently, and maybe historically, than it was. But would this not be a role that anarcho-syndicalist union traditions might well, again, address?
Well, I think they should, could, and maybe have to. I think the organizing the unorganized, a term coined with the best intentions, is problematic, because I think it carries with it the assumption of the mainstream labor movement, which is that organizing means jumping through all the hoops set up by the Labor Relations Board and doing things obtaining recognition for organizations from the state, when in fact that's a cumbersome and in many ways counterproductive way of going about it. But that said, I think what there's no question that those who are interested in helping workers enhance their power and their living standards obviously have to be looking at all these new sectors, new economic sectors, new populations, if you want, and think about ways that they can be drawn into into an economic struggle in new ways, in ways that are adapted to their circumstances. And I think groups like the industrial workers of the world in North America, though very small yet very active, can play a role in this, have to play a role in it. What is that role? It's to create means and supports for those workers to begin acting in a fashion consistent with solidarity. Instead of seeing organizing as a series of bureaucratic steps, starting in their workplaces right now to stand together, to support each other, to formulate grievances and demands, going to their employers in a collective, disciplined, and often polite fashion, and making demands, standing together, seeing ways looking at ways to create organizations that aren't based on a single workplace, but for example might draw workers together from all the different stores in a mall. That's a model that the IWW has attempted with mixed success for sure in certain American cities. Because that's where, when you talk about immigrant populations, that's what you're often talking about. You're talking about retail establishments that are grouped together in shopping centers that have nothing to do with each other except that they occupy the same geographical space. On their own, these enterprises are often, or these outlets, because they're often attached to big enterprises, they're often very small. So what you do get a kind of atomization, if you like, or a segregation of the workers in these areas amongst their many various employers. So how would you organize? You'd organize by attempting to bring all the workers together around some common concerns in this large geographic space, regardless of the fact that they have many different employers. Is that a method that's compatible with the current jump through the Ontario Labour Relations Board's hoops to organize? No, of course not. It'll never work in 1,000 years. You have to ignore that. And you have to say, we're the IWW and we want every worker in Dufferin Mall to come together in an organization that'll defend you at your most, beginning with some very basic things. I'm not going to pretend to know what those basic things are, though they might be a minimum salary or hourly wage for everyone who works in the mall. They might be health and safety concerns that people leaving these jobs late at night have. And the point is not to put your finger on what the issues are. It's to think, well, there are going to be issues because these people are exploited and oppressed, and we need an organization that'll bring them together and not crumble or fail on certain outdated assumptions about what organizing is.
If you could say a little bit about, and I was struck by your point about the kinds of issues that people might want to come together around in the workplace. For instance, I think it was in the 90s, but certainly very recently, the campaign to organize Starbucks in New York might be an example of where an anarcho-syndicalist union, in this case the industrial workers of the world, did address issues relevant to the many people who are currently working in fast food or catering outlets. Could you say a little bit about that?
Well, that's the IWW's drive in New York, and it has extended to other places, but New York was the hub of it, if you like. That's fairly well known now, I think, and that's probably the best example. I mean, it's clear that attempting to go, for lack of a better word, an orthodox route in organizing wasn't going to work there. In fact, I think they even ran into the brick wall of a ruling which told them that you can't actually get official recognition in a single store because the employer is wider than that. So they of course made a virtue of this and so simply started organizing a union in various New York stores, and there was never instead of an attempt to get official blessing for a formal negotiating process going. What they did in these various stores is they began putting pressure on management around certain issues. I remember, I think one of the key catalysts in this, right, was the realization that very few of the workers had enough hours in any of their stores to qualify for the much vaunted health benefits of that coffee empire. And I think, never mind that, the workers weren't getting enough hours to live. They weren't earning enough money. So they started simply to pressure on issues. I think the organizing method was very sound. I think quietly, workers were given the pitch by IWW organizers. They were told, this is why it would be in your interest to act together. Unless you act together, you won't earn enough to live, and you won't get enough hours to qualify for health benefits. And then when a sufficient number of workers in a store had decided to join the IWW, and so force of numbers would make it impossible for the employer to come down that hard on any of them, then they would go public and announce their adhesion to the IWW. An adhesion, I think, that Starbucks itself has always officially denied. I mean, we don't have a union in any of our stores. Nonetheless, there was an organization that had signed up all the workers in numerous stores, and the effects were clear. I mean, the Wobblies in New York showed that hours were, that subsequent to the organizing drive, workers got more hours, wages went up by percentages that would, believe me, would be impressive next to the record of certain unions that bargain officially in New York State and Ontario. But it has to be said, the hard boot came down on some of the leading union activists. There are no methods that are risk-free, and there's always nasty stuff always comes down. But I guess we're getting a bit off topic. What other things? Well, what other initiatives? This was the most famous, and it's the most recent. I mean, I know. I don't know many of the details of this story, but I know that there was a big IWW initiative with 700 odd truckers in California around meeting their a range of demands, all of which were won in the course of an IWW-led strike. This is in the 2000s. I'm not going back in history. I understand that after these gains were made, as is wont to happen with the industrial workers of the world, that collective of truckers kind of faded away. I mean, they got what they wanted, and there was a certain dissolution of the. But nonetheless, it was a great and a victorious struggle. We have. I mean, there are many stories going on right now of IWW led. Efforts in small enterprises to, and they're often informal struggles. They don't take the shape of a sign up cards, and then we'll bargain with the employer and try to solve 3 of your 10 problems. They're direct pressure on employers to improve wages, and I mean they're going on. I happen to know they're going on in Toronto right now in the sort of ancillary health services. In a large community center, places like that. Immigrant warehouse workers in New York. That was a big story in the 2000s. The New York IWW led very impressive struggle in food warehousing in New York to improve to get wages for workers who weren't going to get them, to get back pay. Well, you see, the written contract. The collective agreement is a tricky thing. One might say that the collective agreement is a means by which the workers collectively tie down an employer. But there's another side to it. The collective agreement is also the means by which the workers hands are tied when it comes to struggle. We know that in a formal grievance process in Ontario, for example, workers can only grieve interpretations of the collective agreement that's in place. If something isn't in a collective agreement, then there is no grievance. The direct action, the solidarity union or wobbly method, is to bypass that. Although there are workplaces where the IWW has negotiated a contract. It's happened. I actually negotiated one in a bike repair shop in Toronto. So I'm not saying it doesn't happen, but it was a very simple contract that said very little beyond wages and forms of the way the enterprise would be managed. What's the other way to, how do you act in solidarity without a contract? Well, it's actually very simple, though difficult. The workers stand together. They say, we're together, we're therefore a union. We're not being paid enough. So together we go to the employer and say, we need an increase. We're not gonna let you pick off any of us. We're together, we need more money. What do you say? Sometimes the answer is get lost, but sometimes the answer is from the employer is, oh, well, I see you're all together. You're also quality workers. It might be better for me to give you a 6% increase than to show you the door. That has worked, but it's not always money. I mean, another way of organizing is I mean, the foundation is always the same, that you're together, that you're saying we stand together, we've got each other's backs, and we're not easy to pick off one by one if we act in solidarity. But it can be matters of health and safety. My workplace, it began precisely on that, on a fear that workers were left alone in the evening and in danger from volatile individuals who would come in to use the services of this community center, and that this was unacceptable, and that the answer had to be improved staffing and improved health and safety practices in the place. Had I just complained as a person, as an individual, I might have gotten somewhere and I might not have. But the way that got a response was by getting everyone together to go to the employer and saying, we're not going to put our colleagues at risk, we want improvements. That's as much a union activity, that action, as a signature on a contract that runs for 62 pages and lays out all the terms and conditions under which people will be paid and treated and blah blah. So that would, I think to oversimplify, this alternative union activity is one where you just do it, to quote a famous multinational that makes running shoes. You don't do it carelessly. You organize, you bring people together, you say this is our method, we're together, we're a union. But it does mean, but it often means jumping directly to the stage of demands, jumping over the processes of bureaucratic recognition, going right for the throat, as it were. Money, conditions, safety. And it has risks, but everything has risks. If there isn't solidarity, this is going to fall apart like that. It's worthless. But if you're all together, it often works. And we shouldn't forget that this was the way workers' movements did things prior to say the Second World War and the institutionalization of labor relations. This was how you did it back in the 19th century. The great workers' movements like the Knights of Labor, that's what they relied on. Solidarity. Stand together, put pressure, win what you can, and then get ready for the next battle. The machinery of Rand formula, collective agreement, grievance process that drags on for years. This is an invention of the welfare state, of social democracy, of the post-World War II consensus. It has good things, it has not so good things. What it isn't is eternal. It's just it's something that was historically invented and isn't necessarily the best approach in all regards.
As if guided by some invisible hand, we have arrived at a point of where we are beginning to talk, or Marc has begun to talk about local campaigns. We are engaging in this conversation in Toronto, Ontario, and we have had, thanks largely to the activity of the Industrial Workers of the World Toronto branch. In the last 5 or longer years, we have had a significant amount of activity going on. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit, Marc, about what you think are the lessons learned and the, I guess, both the successes and the limits of the activities that the IWW have engaged in Toronto over the last few years.
Well, I think the lessons are, and this is an optimistic spin on it. I think the lessons is that the society is potentially on the cusp of rapid growth of left libertarian organizations like the IWW. I think one of the things, activists don't will change. We can't really tell when historic watersheds are going to happen. They happen when they're not expected, and the best you can do is try to organize, try to orient movements in a certain way, try to think, try to talk, while underneath the ferment prepares itself. But you never know when it's gonna happen. I mean, this is straight from Bakunin. He said it. He knew it. You can't will stuff like this. But that said, I think, where are we historically? We're at a period where both where the corporate world has been exposed for its inefficiency and criminality, its incapacity for guaranteeing sustained prosperity for everyone. In the wake of course, I refer to the crash of 2008, but we also 2007, 2008. But we're also in a period where I think, for the first time in a long time, young activists look at the state with skepticism, because it's absolutely clear that the state was more than complicit in creating the crisis of 2007 and 8. It was not and it was, so in this way I'm kind of critical of some of those on the left who talk about the current situation, who describe the crash as the failure of big business and corporate North America, or the world. It was, but it was also the failure of the state. The state set up the machine to fall through its errors, through its nepotism, through its policies of favoring the powerful, and it hasn't shown a capacity to solve that. So I think people are looking now, for the first time in a long time, for a solution that takes into account the failures of both the main actors in this, big business and the state, and that's what the libertarian left speaks to. It speaks to collective actions that aren't government organized, at the same time as it recognizes that the system, capitalism or state capitalism or whatever you want to call it, has also failed, and that we need sustainable economic alternatives. Will this spell what we want it to spell? I can't, predictions are it's a bad business to be in, but I think the conditions are set for people to now step back and look. Maybe it's true, big business has screwed up, but maybe what the gospel that socialism has preached for the last few decades isn't the answer either. We need decentralization, we need the empowerment of communities, we need people to do things together for themselves. We need that kind of orientation, something different, which, to be honest, isn't something new. It's something that's been around since the 19th century or earlier, but has been sort of shoved out of the picture for a long time, but now maybe can claim the right to a renaissance.